Welcome to the Effortless Mindfulness Podcast. I'm Loch Kelly, and here I share talks and deep dialogues with leading experts in the field of meditation, psychology, and neuroscience. Together we'll explore how everyday people like you and me can live an awakened life of clarity and compassion. You'll also find micro meditations in every podcast episode. If you want to try more of these, you can go to mindfulglimpses.com to download the new app to experience immediate benefits, because the love and peace we're all seeking is already here, anywhere, anytime. Enjoy. Hi, and welcome. It's my great pleasure today to have my friend and colleague, Kristin Neff, with me. Hi, Kristin.
Hi, Loch. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, who is not interested in compassion? So I would love to begin with you just saying a little about compassion, self-compassion, and some of your research, and a little bit about what you're interested in these days.
Yeah, okay. So, I think compassion is a generally held value, and certainly in spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhism or other contemplative practices, we talk a lot about having compassion for others. But I've always been more interested in what happens when we turn the lens of compassion inward. Right. So about 20 years ago, I created a scale to measure self-compassion, and I did research on it. Although I certainly didn't come up with the idea of self-compassion. I actually first learned about self-compassion. It was my last year of graduate school. I was under a lot of stress. And so I learned mindfulness meditation. Thank goodness I happened to go to a Thich Nhat Hanh Sangha and not some other group, because Thich Nhat Hanh always talked so much about the importance of being compassionate to yourself as well as others. And it really changed my life, this idea of supporting myself when I was struggling, intentionally with warmth and kindness. And so, then I started doing research on it. And that's kind of really how I got to where I am today. But so do you want to know how I define self-compassion, or
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
it's interesting, you'll recognize this. It's kind of really influenced by the fact that I learned about self-compassion while studying in a Thich Nhat Hanh Sangha. He wasn't personally there, but it was his group in the States. So of course there's kindness, warmth, and support, kind of treating yourself like you would treat a good friend. But there's two other elements that I include. One is mindfulness. You really can't be self-compassionate, or I would argue compassionate to others, without mindfulness. Because in order to give compassion, in other words, to open our heart to pain, we have to be willing to be with the pain. And normally either we want to avoid it or ignore it, or we get fused with it, blended with it, we get identified with it. So that we need some perspective to step outside of ourselves and say, wow, you're having a real hard time. How can I help? And so that's what mindfulness provides. And then the other element that really needs to be there is, I called it common humanity, which is basically the understanding. It's not a lot of self and self-compassion. It's just recognizing that the human experience is imperfect, that we make mistakes, we fail, we have challenges. That's actually something that we all share. And if you take it even further, I actually really wanted to call this component interbeing. I called it common humanity because I thought it was more easily understandable. But if you really look at it from this wider perspective, compassion arises when we understand that we aren't in total control. There are so many causes and conditions that arise to affect every single moment. And so, it's not about me or anyone in particular. It's about, how do I frame my experience in light of this kind of universal experience, which is happening, in which there's not really a separate self. And so that's kind of how I formulated it originally, although most people just think of it in simple terms, like, I'm not the only one who suffers, or I'm not the only one who makes mistakes.
Yeah,
so
and they both sides of that make sense, and I think are important, right? That perfectionism or that judgment comes in, that binds us and disconnects us
Right.
So that feeling that we're the same as others, and then the next level of that same as others is even on the deeper level, but even on the
Yes.
animal level, the
Right.
creature level, that isolation factor is what makes that self-centeredness, right?
Exactly, right. So most people, when they make a mistake or even when something happens to them, like even if they get a health condition, irrationally, people don't think this logically, but irrationally, it feels like, everyone else vaguely in the world
Mm-hmm.
is living a normal problem-free life.
Right.
And
Right.
it's just me who's going through this, or just me who's made this mistake or failed in this way. And that sense of isolation, I think, is really
Mm-hmm.
the most psychological damaging aspect of lacking self-compassion, right? When we blame ourselves, when we judge ourselves, when we feel all alone, we feel abnormal. And so self-compassion, by reminding us that we aren't alone, that actually our imperfection is what connects us to others, not what isolates us from them. And then really importantly, the warmth. So the mindfulness world, I mean, amazing, all the wonderful work done by mindfulness practitioners and research on mindfulness, but it's a little more cognitive. It's more about just our awareness, having our awareness be with what is, which is key. Again, it's part of the model, but it's not just about space, it's also about warmth. And I suppose, when I came onto the scene, I saw that as kind of a shortcoming of a lot of certainly the scientific side of research on mindfulness. They just talked about an awareness. They weren't going to the warmth side. And it's
Right.
absolutely key for well-being that our hearts are open. And I don't need to tell you
Right.
that, obviously.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the interesting thing as we, both the research, moving psychologically and also in terms of mindfulness and its
Yeah.
development.
Yeah.
There's both in all traditions of mindfulness, there's those first two parts. First is just watching your breath and your mind
Yeah.
wanders, come back. So developing some attentiveness and ability to focus,
Yeah.
and then that non-judgmental witnessing and mindfulness in that mindful awareness as it is non-judgmental. Some people try to say it has kindness, but that stage does not. It's necessary to detach in order to be purely observing, but in the other traditions, then there's a bigger mindfulness, which is more of a pure awareness, and then a discovery of natural qualities of almost unconditional love or sameness or interbeing or interconnectedness, where it doesn't come from attitudinal kindness put on top of or creating a part of that's kind, but
Yes.
is arising from within naturally. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. So just for instance, when I remember presenting at a conference that John Kabat-Zinn was at,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think he was very happy with, just because,
Yeah.
but for the good reason. He thought, well,
Yeah.
compassion naturally arises when mindfulness is there.
Right.
And I think it is true at some level, as you say, when we aren't just focusing or we aren't just paying attention to, but when we feel that sense of oneness, when we're just pure awareness, there's a quality to it, and that quality is kindness. But I've always been, and it's really interesting bringing the IFS into this because I wasn't aware of maternal family systems at the time, but it makes sense. I was never aiming the work I did at the meditation practitioner who'd like meditated for 10,000 hours. I was interested in like the common person on the street who had no idea about meditation and how does self-compassion help them. Now, from that stance, from the kind of normal everyday mind, you have to be intentional about it. It's not going to arise naturally. You need to intentionally call up that part of yourself, which is still there. You don't need to meditate for a long time. Everyone has, I think, a self or compassionate self, as Dick would say, the self quality. So intentionally calling it up. And the way I found worked is if you just think of how would you be to a friend who is suffering, who is going through the same thing you did? And so people can access that part of themselves more easily when they think about giving compassion to someone else. and then you intentionally bring that kindness to yourself. So it's really working at different levels. And I've always been
Yes.
really interested in where people are, like where they're starting, not just eventually where they're going to end up at.
Yeah. I know that biologically, compassion is a natural quality toward others. And
Yes.
interestingly, having, initially taught more Theravada insight meditation and go through the series of loving kindness practices you start with sending it to somebody who is like a mentor.
Yes.
So they're not even emotionally close, but they've given you compassion and you respect or feel appreciative.
Right.
And then you go to someone you love, and then it gets harder and harder. And sometimes you go all the way to an enemy and then come to yourself. And people say, the enemy was really hard, but the self, now that's the extreme, And there's something about the move, what I call the mindful move, which is the first mindful move, which is disidentifying or stepping back or unhooking or looking at yourself or splitting yourself into two, so that it almost requires a relationality. But of course, as we go along, we'll explore that.
Yeah.
Who are you talking to? You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Who's the one who's compassionate to who? Is that the self or is this the self?
Which is so funny. And by the way, my original formulation, I have a negative, so a kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and mindfulness versus over-identification. So I actually talked about that at the very beginning, that is what mindfulness does, is it unhooks you from the identification with the thoughts and feelings, or really the sense of self. But I was going to come back to something you said. Oh yeah, loving kindness practice. And so usually, in contemplative traditions, loving kindness practice is the main way people generate self-compassion. Right? If they do compassion, it might be something more like Tonglen, where you're breathing in the suffering and transforming it. And so loving kindness is like the flip side of compassion, but you need suffering for it to be compassion. And suffering is really where the rubber hits the road, because it's when we're suffering, especially when that suffering is, I feel shame, I feel inadequate, or something's really difficult. It's a lot harder to be with our suffering when it's than just to be in general kind of friendly and beneficent that gets generated through loving kindness. So for instance, all the practices that I developed to help teach self-compassion, which were mainly with my colleague, Chris Germer, for instance, we call up suffering. It's not just general, may I be well, may I be happy, or other people. It's like, think about something that you're suffering with right now. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you're having a relationship issue. So you start with the suffering. And then instead of just, wishing yourself well, we do things more concrete, like put your hands on your heart. Can you give yourself some warmth and kindness for how hard it is to feel this way, remembering that you aren't alone? So it's, I think it's, ironically, you have to intentionally call in the suffering when you're practicing self-compassion in a way that you don't with loving kindness. So that's also, although loving kindness practice, the research shows, increases self-compassion, because it's like you're building the muscle of friendliness. And then you hope it continues when suffering arises. But it doesn't always.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's that kind of separating or disidentifying, being too enmeshed or too attached, and then being too detached or too dissociated, or too in denial, or too much shut down, where you're not feeling anything. Is still like the cold side, and
that's
the hot opposite is hatred, and the near enemy is self-pity, is pity.
Yes.
So, it's interesting developmentally, because the people do know self-awareness. So at the age of 1.5 to 3, there's a psychological thing that most people don't even know about, and certainly the term is odd when they hear it, because it's more like being self-conscious, except it's actually a developmental stage where we're kind of identified as a baby, having grown up, not even using language or separating ourselves out. And then we start to realize we're an object, and then we're a subject and an object. And we start to split off into hearing, don't touch the hot stove. And then we start to talk to ourselves and say, oh, you shouldn't touch the hot stove. And that begins this kind of process of a kind of ordinary mindfulness that's internal, and then can become the judge or the critic or the superego.
It's actually did my postdoc in self-concept development. So
okay.
I
good.
used to
Okay.
think about this a lot. So it's really interesting. So if you really want to see how the sense of self arises, and this is where mindfulness comes in, is through representational ability. The self is a representation, right? So the first representation usually is pointing, and then language sets in, and right about that time is when there's a representation, a thought, me, that stands in for self. And then, they have the mirror recognition task, which is a bit messy because it adds another layer of complication onto it. But nonetheless, it kind of shows that a visual representation stands for me. And then, so this is why, if you look at why thought is a real problem, the self is just a thought. And thought is usually is a representational system, right? It's either images or usually words. And so if you start seeing where it all started to go to hell in a handbasket, right? Is when we first learned our very first words. That's that first step away from direct awareness of reality into thinking about reality. So,
although it gets interesting there, because now we're talking about self in a number of ways.
Yes, that's right. In general,
because there is that, you could say, the self-representational, the conceptual mind, but then it's also the recognition that there is a creature here that can't cross the street, that if it crosses the street at a red light and a car comes, it will, and it's not the concept, it's actually the physical separate self, which is a human body.
Right.
So the body mind is where a lot of people, there's no self, but there's a body mind that, it's the name, you're using a name, or it's calling yourself by a name. If you only get, it's like, no, there's no problem with that. Where it gets caught is when it actually consciously self-references. So it's not the representation, but the self-concept that creates like a part or a mini me that starts to self-reference and look out as if the self is in this small driver of the vehicle, even though it thinks it's talking about the vehicle. It thinks it's talking about the whole body mind.
I'm curious, it's really interesting. Can you do that without representational thought?
I mean, you think of an animal that has, backed into a corner, it knows the body, and it immediately responds. So it knows it's a creature. So it's not using concepts.
Right.
I mean, do you say that? Would you call that a kitten? A kitten? We have two kittens, so
yeah. But this is really interesting, by the way. I'm totally geeking out on this. So, do animals have a separate self?
Yeah, they have they have, depending on what you call self. So if they have a self, they have a. So this is the
duality.
Yes, they have they have a body object duality, but they don't have the secondary neurotic self-referencing part. And that's the thing that's confusing
see. That makes sense.
Is that there is a dualistic world that's relatively real. But that the self-referencing mini me that keeps going to the past, projecting worst case scenarios into the future,
and evaluating this concept,
and evaluating can relax. And then there's a kind of an awareness that you can move your hand or use thought as a tool.
Right.
So it's kind of just getting everything in order that it becomes underdeveloped as a baby because we're creatures different than a lot of animals that take so long to develop. And then we go to school age and we're
And then
over to,
and then you have parts, so parts into the mix, and it gets
right. That's
incredibly
right.
complicated because, so when I was studying self-concept development, which was, way back in the 90s, right? We weren't talking about parts. There was like a self and a self-concept. Although actually the woman interestingly, I studied with Susan Harder, and she had this whole idea of multiple selves. And that, that's a developmental stage where we have different parts of ourselves. She actually did talk about parts, but she didn't. Dick Schwartz hadn't been doing his work yet. So it's, that line between, well, are they different self concepts, different parts of ourselves, or are they actual, as Dick would say, actual parts, almost like ontological entities that have different
Right.
agendas, and I guess
Yeah.
that's what we need, self-compassion. You get really
Right.
confused by it all. And it's like, oh,
Well,
okay.
I
I'm
mean, we
here right
kind of want
now.
to, I think the thing is though, there has to be some taking it apart to get to the how.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the only reason that I think you and I do that is
Yeah.
besides the fact that we do love to geek out a little
Yeah.
bit. But but besides that, there's the felt sense of the difference between something like pity
Yeah.
and empathy and kindness and compassion, and then compassionate part of me that can be very compassionate toward myself, and then what I call, instead of self-compassion, the compassionate self, which is the self that's aware of the part that's trying to be compassionate the best it can, as a polarized part to the part that feels shame or judgment. And those two are parts within a system: thoughts, feelings, sensations. They're very human, and they're very good to get in touch with. But the difference, just as there's a difference between empathy and compassion and kindness, that this unconditional loving being, interbeing, is not just the first move of learning to say kind things to yourself. There's actually an interconnected loving presence that then still has a kind of a relational in between, but it also has an ocean and wave, that the ocean that's connected to everyone else and is not separate is arising as these parts, but then is connected within the body, and one is really feeling shame and the other's judgment and the other's being kind. And then the key is, for me, in this non-dual compassion, is to really feel like you can feel toward all of that and don't have to just create a part as the last entity of compassion with a small c.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting. So, like I said, the way I've, up until now, mainly researched and taught self-compassion is at a very kind of relative level, everyday
Mm-hmm.
mind, small self, because I think that's useful. People need it, and I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
confuse people. But now I'm a little more interested, because I've done that. We've developed practices, very concrete, practical, pragmatic, very secular. But one of the things that's, when people ask me, I don't feel I'm worthy of self-compassion, or I just don't know how to do it. And yeah, I can give techniques and stuff, but what's really happening at its core is, this is the limitation of the small self. When you're identified with small self, and it feels like I am generating compassion toward me, first of all, and if that I feels inadequate or incapable or didn't have good modeling, or maybe hasn't had good friendships, so hasn't even developed that skill with others, sometimes that happens, it's putting kind of this burden on this imaginary separate self as the one generating the compassion. Whereas then when I practice self-compassion, and I think a lot of people of the contemplative tradition, it's not even like a part of me or small self is giving compassion to another part of me. I'm just tuning into the compassion that's here already. And I think that's actually, I don't know if it's a more accurate way to say it, but there's certainly another way in. So it kind of avoids all that who is giving compassion to whom, and it's just a quality of awareness itself. And so, for instance, that's why one of the things that works is when you use physical touch and you just put your hand on your body, because I think you let go of that idea that I am generating compassion. It's just the feeling of warmth. So, and I think I talked with you a little bit about this earlier. I'm very interested in finding different doorways in for people, especially those who have trouble generating compassion for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
by tapping directly into loving awake awareness.
Yes.
Especially if, and one of the things I love about your work is you
Mm.
don't have to, go to 30 silent meditation retreats to be able to do this. It's
Mm.
very kind of practical, easy ways that people can tap into it because it's already there. And I think
Yeah.
that's just so fascinating, because I think if we, you and I would both agree that's really where it's coming from. It's
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they say it's like the air you breathe or the ocean you're in. It's
Mm-hmm.
not really me generating compassion,
Right. There's an identification that then we have only these tools of fight, flight, freeze, get it together, work hard, try our best, and then we discover this first stage of mindfulness, which is stepping back and realizing, oh, that's a thought, that's a, feeling that's coming, going, or that's a part. The same kind of move where you are aware of a part within you and you ask for some space, and then you're aware of the part from another part, which then, and then this first move of non-duality is where a lot of people actually define it as non-duality in some traditions. So they call it non-dual awareness is non-duality.
Right.
But in Buddhism, in more Dzogchen Mahamudra style, that's one half of the non-duality.
Uh-huh.
That's
Yeah.
a new duality.
Uh-huh.
Because if you say I'm not this, I'm that, well, what's this?
Yeah. Right.
So the non-duality actually means ultimate and relative are not two, and that non-dual awareness and aliveness are unity. The ultimate and the relative
Yes.
have, and when they come together, so that move away is kind of stepping out of conditioning.
Yeah.
And you need to kind of, sometimes I say it just takes 3 seconds to 3 minutes of pure awareness to just unplug and then to rest as the ground. But then you want to just have that feeling of what's arising and what it feels like. The difference is that it's not it's not a sky with thoughts coming through it, which is like choiceless awareness, which is like
right.
a very high meditation state.
And you identify with the sky.
And you're the sky and you're not the birds, or you call it a movie.
Yeah.
You're the movie screen, but you're actually the ocean and wave.
Yeah.
So you're the ocean, and the waves of anger, terror, shame, they're made of love. They're made of the awareness is arising, and its first quality is unconditional love, meaning it's unconditioned and it has no conditions about judging, but it is also unconditionally loving because it's the same. It's interbeing or same.
And so the loving, or you might say compassionate quality, love in general, compassion at what's arising is suffering.
Yes.
So you might say that only comes into being or is experienced when there is some sense of duality, or is that in the relative?
No, that's the relative.
Okay,
The actual fabric.
Again, straight out question: is compassion only at the relative level?
I mean, no, because there's ultimate bodhicitta. So ultimate compassion is kind of the ultimate insight of wisdom and love together. It's almost like from the emptiness of awareness and aliveness and humanity and eons passing through and timelessness and relative suffering, that heart, that feeling with the being the same as, it's like, look at what's going on. Oh my God, all my family is going through such suffering, and the suffering is both, physical, mental, emotional, and existential, meaning not being awake. So that, that's relative bodhicitta, which is that kind of word in Tibetan that means awake consciousness or compassionate mind or heart mind. And then ultimate bodhicitta, which is the fabric of reality. And then it comes into relative form, and it gives you the insight, ultimate of awake insight, which is that who you are can't be hurt,
Right.
and yet there's pain and states within this precious human birth that are never going to be not hurt. They're never going to be beyond pain and neutrality and rising states, but that the solution is not within, reducing it only on a relative level.
Right. One of the things that I found interesting just in my personal path, and I think there's some personality differences in that, is that I found that I could only really, even though you kind of need to be mindful in order to be self-compassionate, I found that for me, love, the kindness, which is actually was for me the first step. That having that warmth, that sense of safety that came from giving myself unconditional support, kindness, warmth, is actually what allowed me to go to that kind of first scary territory of, what do you mean there's no self? Or, what do you mean there's, I don't have real control and this is all an illusion. And so sometimes I wonder if, sometimes I get the sense among some people that compassion is almost seen as a secondary path, not quite as advanced as the more wisdom traditions. When I do think for some people, it's actually the key doorway in.
Yes.
And that can be as simple as not only just sitting down to meditate, but putting your hands on your heart when you sit down to meditate. And just that simple act actually changes your field in a way that I think makes everything else a lot easier.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And certainly in the yogic traditions, there's, bhakti yoga, and there's service, seva,
Right.
so practices of devotion, practices of service, practices of, and, that's part of all contemplative traditions. And the ultimate in certainly Tibetan Buddhism is compassion, that they say there's, the three qualities of awakeness are emptiness, clarity, and compassionate expression. So compassionate expression could be the door in, and certainly it's the same way. And it's not, sometimes the more compassionate styles don't get to the emptiness, and sometimes the emptiness style don't get to the compassion.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting also, self-compassion. Obviously, I think it's interesting because, well, first of all, even like, I have to say, even in Buddhist traditions, the self-compassion was met with like a what? It's more, yeah, okay, you include yourself in the circle of loving kindness, but really what we want is compassion, selflessness, things like that. The interesting thing about self-compassion is we have our own suffering is the one we have most immediate access to 24/7. So to the extent that opening our heart to suffering is this doorway in to this larger understanding, that, to this loving awake awareness, it really almost makes a lot more sense to start with your own. Because I'm the one who always here. I know I feel mine. It's always here. It's, yours. I may or may not be thinking about it, but mine is always right here. It's like the doorway that's constantly coming up in my awareness. And so I almost think that that's, for many people, the first place to start is self-compassion. Then all the other stuff can start coming in. But
there's a famous quote. I don't know that I've read it. Usually we'll look things up, but supposedly says, at least I've heard Buddhist teachers say it, that you can search the whole world over and never find someone as worthy as yourself for compassion.
Of compassion, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And for me personally, I would say that it was compassion that gave me my first kind of opening to awake consciousness when I was grieving my father's death a year after he died.
Yeah.
And I was kind of trying to talk in college to my friends, and they hadn't had that experience. So they were like, "Oh yeah, cool. Let's go do something."
Right.
And then I talked to, kind of like school counselor who was like a Freudian. He sat there and just took notes. And I was like, "Oh boy, what are we going to do here?" So I kind of like, kind of muddled along, and I came out of the library one night on a beautiful, crisp winter night, and I just must have been a part, or could have been something said, "I don't know if you can take this much longer." And I went like, "Who was that?" And I looked through, and I kind of opened my awareness up, and it just kept going out, and it went out to this night sky, and then it was like, "Oh, that's me." It wasn't like, "Oh, that's God" or something. It was like, and then it just like, oh, I just started crying, and like I felt so tenderhearted, and almost laughing, and the kind of laugh cry, but the deep sobbing and like relief of, and then it felt like, oh, this is what can give me, oh, here's what I need, and it was that fullness, a wholeness of whatever that was. I didn't think of it in religious or spiritual but it did lead me to do what I'm doing today,
Yeah.
So I see that as self-compassion. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely got me on my path dealing with some pretty intense personal suffering. And it's interesting, my books, I write a lot about my personal story because it's really the doorway in for so many people. I mean, philosophy or even just abstract research, it's usually not the way in. It's people's personal stories because everyone has a story, and that's the thing you
Yes.
can relate to most easily.
Yeah. And then I think that's right. I think, sharing personal stories. And then the next thing people want is not the philosophy or but the how to.
Yes, the practice. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So what is the practical? Just don't even explain what I'm doing. Like,
yeah.
And so, you see that, in the meditations I lead, I start with this and a heart hug, a self hug, and then putting the hand behind the head, for this primal. So even people who are very mental or resist, sometimes, cultural males, won't, touch or say, but but they'll do hand positions. They'll be like sit with your hands like this. Okay. Okay, well, sit with your hands like this. Now sit with your hands like, now feel with that. Now giving and receiving. Now like this. And all of a sudden, that pre-verbal, pre-representational communication of self to self. So it's like splitting it off. So as if there's another, and sometimes I say, use your non-dominant hand.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because then you're kind of almost receiving it. You're doing it, but you're also able to receive it a little bit more.
Yeah. It was one colleague did a research study that compared, if someone like puts their hand on you, it lowers cortisol. And if you put your own hand on yourself, it also lowers cortisol.
Oh, wow.
So you're just tapping it, the touch is the universal signal of care, pre-verbal, right? So self-touch is so important. People these days, they don't have time to meditate. Not everyone wants to meditate.
Right.
So can we create a 5-minute glimpse that gets people to give self-compassion with a capital S?
Yes, that's it. They're in the app already, and there are more coming. More to come.
Yeah. So I'll play with it and see how
and
I can.
I'm glad to. I'd love to. We'll collaborate. We'll create some more like we were just doing now.
Yeah. And
playing with this.
And the big difference, I think, with self-compassion practice is that you usually start with what you're feeling badly about.
Yes.
It's not abstract, and that's why it's useful because, even like therapists, I'll say, think of something in your life right now, and everyone has something, and then it makes it real and not theoretical, or not just like building the skill in the abstract. You're building the skill
Yeah.
on the job, so to speak, which is when we're working with the suffering you're dealing with.
Yeah, you're bringing wherever the holding and
Yes.
the life, where life is meeting your most tender place, and where where you're in some ways most alive, that, but because it's most alive, you're using defenses, you're using typical ego defenses or protective parts
Yes.
and you don't realize that. You think it's just the hurt or the shame, but it's actually the judgment and the the flight, or the fight,
Yeah.
or the projection. It's their fault. No, it's my fault. No, it's
That's
their
right.
fault. No, it's my fault.
All
And
this.
those are all happening. Yeah.
Do you ever, what about talking about this as a quality of awareness? Like sometimes I just throw that in. I'm not sure how it lands for people, to be honest. What's your
Yeah.
experience of talking about
Well,
compassion as a quality of awareness?
the only thing is, I don't think people know what awake awareness is.
Right,
So
I see. So that's right. I guess that's true. For me, it works. But
yes,
if yeah, okay.
but it's not a quality of attention,
It's not
and
a quality of attention. That's
it's
right.
not even a quality of mindful awareness, but it is a quality of true nature or higher self, or no self or whatever, being or interbeing or whatever. That it's a quality, meaning not like personality quality, but it's like its first expression, or its flavor, or its form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. So form is emptiness. Okay, got that. No form. So now, when emptiness is form, well, wait a minute. What's form?
Yeah.
Like it now is dancing, because it's not invisible. It's not nothing.
Yes. And that
It's
form as a flavor, which is loving.
That's it.
That's
That's
right.
it. And form, ultimately, that's its
Mm.
same, because it's same. The reason it's loving is because it's the ground of being, meaning interbeing is, oh, we're not separate.
Yes.
So it's connected
Yes.
in the ultimate connection,
Yes.
which even Gabor Mate and others saying trauma, its main thing is it disconnects.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this is the real connection. You feel connected, and then you feel grounded. Like some people will say, what do you notice? I feel grounded. Oh, what's the ground made of? They're like, what do you mean? Like, do you feel grounded? Oh, yeah. Well, what's the ground made of? Like awareness and love? Yes. Okay. That's but that's a
Yeah.
ground? That's, doesn't it moving or empty or something? Yeah, no, it's the ground.
Yeah.
It's safe, and it's safe.
And which is why, like, I think that that bringing in the warmth actually is what it often helps you bring in the space, because it's hard to give space when you're scared. So you contract, but when you give yourself the warmth, you feel safe, and that actually allows the space to rise.
Yeah, and finding that warmth of that is feels like there's nothing that can threaten me. I'm safe because I'm interconnected with everything, and nothing is, and then I come into a unique form that on the physical and emotional level can feel threatened, or potentially hurt, but the existential ground can't be. So now it's the non-dual is the
Right.
when they come together.
And then a slightly more at the relative level, but another way of putting that, I think, is unconditional self-acceptance. So in my early work, I always made a big difference between self-esteem and self-compassion.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
self-esteem is a judgment, is an evaluation, it's contingent, it depends on success or failure. Self-compassion, which is rooted just in the only thing you need to be is a flawed human being, which is if you always check that box. So it gives you a sense of worth as unconditional, which gives you a sense of safety, unlike something like self-esteem. And that sense of
Right.
safety kind of allows for you to open up and see yourself more clearly and, do the nurturing. Was interesting. So I find that common humanity is where people get most lost when I talk about self-compassion. It's really key. And part of it is because the word is, you can use It works for a lot of people, but it's really what it's pointing to is something deeper, which is like this essential interconnection. But even something easy to understand, like we're all human beings, people you can see this is the big problem. One of the big problems with kind of our world today is like, what do you mean? I'm supposed to feel happy that other people are suffering, or that's one way to go. Or they say, um, you know, how can I feel badly about myself? There are people in war zones, so it's like very comparative. People have a very hard time feeling that common humanity. I think because the pressures of our society are so isolating now. And I also think that that's really the doorway in for most people because that's where we get stuck. Um,
Yes.
so
Yeah, and certainly just on so the other way is perfection and imperfection. That, I don't have to be perfect or right or better than, less than is the other one.
right.
So that we're the same means not up and down and always like it's I'm less than. No, they're the enemy. Those people believe this,
Yes.
which just gets into the whole political thing.
Yeah.
But that seeing or that feeling of humanity that isn't doesn't have to become like even some of the spiritual and psychological ideals of transcendent or awake or happy. Someday I'll be okay if only I get this.
Yes.
So that and people are afraid, as you say, of like, oh, then I'll be lazy or something, like then won't be motivated, right? But it's really like when I say to some people, how do you feel? And someone says, okay. And I feel, yeah, it's okay. And then someone will say, well, okay is not good enough.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa, okay is really good. You should check out this okay.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Well, and that's the nice thing where the research comes in because like, no matter what culture I'm talking to, the same things come up. It's self-pity. It's going to make me reject responsibility. It's self-indulgent. It's selfish.
Right.
It'll undermine my motivation and it'll make me weak. Same ones
Yes.
over and over again. What's nice now is we have like hundreds of studies, thousands of studies in total, but actually directly like through experimental manipulation. Is it true? If you give people self-compassion manipulation, for instance, which we do, you might find this interesting. So we have maybe people think about some way they'd hurt someone and they write a paragraph with mindfulness, just kind of trying to be aware, turn toward it, not away from it. Common humanity, remember that you aren't alone, it's part of being human, and then some words of kindness, and then see like what that does in a lab setting. And so, for instance, it helps people take more personal responsibility and they have a stronger desire to make amends, things like that. So, and whether it's motivation or any of these myths that we have or concerns, they're directly disproven by research, which is nice to be able to have that up your sleeve. So, gotta say. Because the mind the mind fights. That part of it, the manager parts. And the
and
manager
especially
parts,
the real intellectual parts that like, and then you're like, well, how about research? And I'm like, okay, never mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Then maybe, but the other part of common humanity is the interpsychic. In other words, that once you're introduced to this loving self, then you can realize, oh, wait a minute, I have shameful parts, but I also have hateful parts, and I have mean parts, and I have judgmental parts toward so those parts we project out.
Yes.
Like, oh, we all have these. Oh, those are just feelings. Oh, those are common human feelings that arise because there's so much, even from psychology, religion, and consciousness, that says, just let them go, they're nothing, or just thinking an evil thought is evil, and one of the keys is that the first arrow in Buddhism is that what's arising initially, you're not doing that.
Right.
That's just biologically arising, a first reaction of anger or terror or fight or flight or even hatred, And then it's the response to that that can change by saying, okay, that's a normal feeling. Then self-compassion comes in to be with your common humanity. But the key is about part is it's helpful where it's helpful for me is that, oh, it's not me. It's almost not the way it is formed, but the way you can step back from it as not me and yet not say it's nothing.
Yes, right.
So that's
It's,
so it
it's
fits
an
into
in-between,
it's an in-between thing that's a missing link, I think. Well, Kristin, this has been so much fun and
it's been great fun. Yeah. Thanks, Loch.
welcome. In the usual self-compassion practices, who is compassionate to whom? What self is compassionate to what self? In the following approach, we're going to realize that who we are is not a small self or a no self, but by shifting to awake consciousness, which has this quality of natural loving kindness, unconditional love, and ultimate compassion, we can be compassionate to different selves or different parts of ourself, different mind states. This is why many people find it difficult to do loving kindness toward themselves because of this operating from these self-like parts and trying to feel this relative loving kindness that has a difficulty with its polar opposite of a self that's confused or anxious or doubting. So begin by settling in and becoming aware of your body, supported on a chair or a cushion. And notice your breath that's happening naturally by itself without any effort. And then just begin to focus on this one area of your body that's rising and falling at your chest or belly. And feel a particular area that you're focusing on. And then shift to become aware of the focuser. And just notice what is the location, size, shape, or feeling of this part of you. And can you begin by thanking this part of you for all its hard work, for its effort to meditate, try to live this life. And just see whether you can appreciate this part of you. And just notice now that where you're appreciating this part from is another part, a self-like part or a meditator that's kind of in relationship, another mini-me committee member. And just open and ask these parts if they can give you some space. Notice where are you aware of these two parts from? Who's aware? of the efforting part that was focusing on the breath, and the part that was appreciating or sending loving kindness to that. Just opening, and from this space, resting as the awareness that's aware. Just unplugging for a moment. And then finding the connection by asking, how do you feel toward these two parts? Not from your head, but from your open-hearted awareness. Just feel curious and connected to this part, particularly the one that's worked so hard to live this life. And just notice, is this part aware that you're here with it? Can this part feel your curiosity and ultimate compassion toward it? And see if there's anything this part wants to let you know. Or ask it. What it believes that keeps it working so hard. And what is it afraid would happen if it didn't? And just listening. No need to change it. No need to heal it. Just feel that unconditional love and interconnection that allows this part just to be as it is without dissolving it or having pity on it or needing to change it at all. See how that part feels when it's regarded from this awake consciousness in this way. And when this part turns to be aware of where you're aware from, what does it experience as the location, size, and feeling of awake consciousness, of open-hearted awareness? Notice if there's any distance or whether there's almost a natural interconnection and relational quality. And how does it feel to be aware of this part of you and to be aware of another part that tries to be appreciative and grateful and generate loving kindness? Just notice and thank that part for its effort to try to create what you already are. Let that part feel what it's like to feel this ultimate loving kindness that's like a fabric of the field of reality. This natural, unconditional love that's like an ocean from which your body, and these parts arise. See what it's like to shift into this view and welcome these two parts and all parts. So see if there's any other parts that appear within or around your body. Scared parts, judging parts, smart parts, emotional parts. Just as they arise, just welcoming them to the playground. Just regarding them without identifying or investigating or analyzing. Making space and feeling the connection. Letting them feel what they've all been searching for. This love and safety and clarity. How is it being this open-hearted you with your body and all parts welcome? Just notice, feel the safety and the clarity, and just curious whether this is a state, a meditation state, or essentially who you are. And curiously, could you live from here, move from here, talk from here, internally to these parts and externally toward friends and family and work? And if you could, would you want to? Is this your heart's desire that could lead you home to live from this that is already here? Enjoy. Thanks for listening. This podcast is offered freely. And if you've enjoyed this, please download a free trial of our new app at mindfulglimpses.com. There we offer daily micro meditations and in-depth programs to support your awakening.